Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki, Grantaraj Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam ki, Samaveda Bhaktivinoda ki, Gaur Premananda. All glories to Simul devotees, all glories to Simul devotees, all glories to Shri Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Gananjana Shalakhaya Chakshur Anmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Brindavan Eshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So we are on Canto 2, Chapter 3, text, what is it, 24. Oh, come on, I hit the wrong one. There we go. A very interesting verse, also another famous verse. A lot of famous verses in this section. I'm amazed. I never somehow had focused in on that aspect of Canto 2. So, here we go. Tad ashmasharam hridayam batedam. Tad ashmasharam hridayam batedam. Yad grihyamanayar harinam dhehyai. Yad grihyamanayar harinam dhehyai. Nadvirikyetat yadavikado. Navrikyetat yadavikado. Netre jalam gatra ruheshu harshaha. Netre jalam gatra ruheshu harshaha. Dadasmasharam hridayam batedam. Yad grihamanayar harinama dhehyai. Navrikyatat yadavikado. Netre jamangatra ruheshu harshaha. Tad ashmasharam hridayam batedam. Yad grihamanayar harinama dehyai. Navikriyetat yadavikaro. Netre jalam gatra ruheshu harshaha. Tad ashmasharam hridayam batedam. Yad grihamanayar harinama dehyai. Navrikriyetat yadavikaro. Netre jalam gatra ruheshu harshaha. Tad ashmasharam hridayam batedam. Yad grihyamanayar harinama dehyai. Navrikriyetat yadavikaro. Netre jalam gatra ruheshu harshaha. Ladies. Tad ashmasharam hridayam batedam. Yad grihamanayar harinama dehyai. Navrikyetat yadavikaro. Netre jalam gatra ruheshu harshaha. Tad ashmasharam hridayam batedam. Yad grihyamanayar harinama dehyai. Navrikriyetat yadavikaro. Netre jalam gatra ruheshu harshaha tat that ashmasharam is still framed. Hridayam heart. Mutta idam certainly that. Yat which. Hridamanai in spite of chanting. Harinama the holy name of the Lord. Dehyai by the concentration of the mind. Na does not. Vikriyeta change. Atha thus. Yada when. Vikara reaction. Netre in the eyes. Jalam tears. Gatra ruheshu at the pores. Harshaha eruptions of ecstasy. So here is the translation by Srila Prabhupada. Certainly that heart is steel framed, which, in spite of one's chanting the holy name of the Lord with concentration, does not change. When ecstasy takes place, tears fill the eyes and hairs stand on end. So I say, and you please repeat, certainly that heart is steel framed. Which, in spite of one's chanting the holy name of the Lord, with concentration, does not change when ecstasy takes place. Tears fill the eyes and the hairs stand on end. So we've got a lengthy purport here. We should note with profit that in the first 3 chapters of the second canto, a gradual process of development of devotional service is being presented. In the first chapter, the first step in devotional service for God consciousness by the process of hearing chanting has been stressed, and a gross conception of the personality of Godhead in his universal form for the beginners is recommended. By such a gross conception of God, through the material manifestations of his energy, one is enabled to spiritualize the mind and senses and gradually concentrate the mind upon Lord Vishnu, the Supreme, who is present as the Supersoul in every heart and everywhere, in every atom of the material universe. The system of Panchu Upasana, recommending 5 mental attitudes for the common man, is also enacted for this purpose, namely gradual development, worship of the superior that may be in the form of fire, electricity, sun, the mass of living beings, Lord Shiva, and at last the impersonal Supersoul, the partial representation of Lord Vishnu. They are all nicely described in the second chapter. But the third chapter, further development is prescribed after one has actually reached the stage of Vishnu worship or pure devotional service. And the mature stage of Vishnu worship is suggested herein in relation to the change of heart. The whole process of spiritual culture is aimed at changing the heart of the living being in the matter of his eternal relation with the Supreme Lord as subordinate servant, which is the eternal constitutional position. So, with the progress of devotional service, the reaction of change in the heart is exhibited by gradual detachment from the sense of material enjoyment by a false sense of lording it over the world, and an increase in the attitude of rendering loving service to the Lord. Vidhi bhakti, or regulated devotional service, by the limbs of the body, namely the eyes, the ears, the nose, the hands, and the legs, as already explained herein before, is now stressed. herein in relation to the mind, which is the impetus for all activities of the limbs of the body. It is expected by all means that by discharging regulated devotional service, one must manifest the change of heart. If there is no such change, the heart must be considered steel-framed. For it is not melted even when there is chanting of the holy name of the Lord. We must always remember that hearing and chanting are the basic principles of discharging devotional duties. And if they are properly performed, there will follow the reactional ecstasy with signs of tears in the eyes and the standing of hairs on the body. These are natural consequences and are preliminary symptoms of the bhava stage, which occurs before one reaches the perfectional stage of prema, love of Godhead. If the reaction does not take place, even after continuous hearing and chanting of the holy name of the Lord, it may be considered to be due to offenses only. That is the opinion of the Sandarbha. In the beginning of chanting the holy name of the Lord, if the devotee has not been very careful in evading 10 kinds of offenses at the feet of the holy name, certainly the reaction of feelings of separation will not be visible by tears in the eyes or the standing of hair on the end. The bhava stage is manifest by 8 transcendental symptoms, namely inertness, perspiration, standing of hairs on end, failing in the voice, trembling, paleness of the body, tears in the eyes, and finally trance. The Nectar of Devotion, a summary study of Srila Rupa Goswami's Bhaktam Rasamrita Sindhu, explains those symptoms and vividly describes other transcendental developments, both in steady and accelerating manifestations. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has very critically discussed all these bhava displays in connection with some unscrupulous neophytes imitating the above symptoms for cheap appreciation. Not only Vishwanath Chakravarti, but also Srila Rupa Goswami treated them very critically. Sometimes all the above 8 symptoms of ecstasy are imitated by mundane devotees, the prakrita sahajiyas, but the pseudo-symptoms are at once detected when one sees the pseudo-devotee addicted to so many forbidden things. Even though decorated with signs of a devotee, a person addicted to smoking, drinking, or illegitimate sex with women cannot have all the above mentioned ecstatic symptoms. But it is seen that sometimes these symptoms are willfully imitated. And for this reason, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti accuses the imitators of being stone-hearted men. They are sometimes even affected by the reflection of such transcendental symptoms. Yet, if they still do not give up the forbidden habits, they are hopeless cases for transcendental realization. When Lord Chaitanya met Srila Ramananda Roy of Kavaur in the bank of the Godavari, the Lord developed all these symptoms. But because of the presence of some non-devotee brahmanas who were attendants of the Rai, the Lord suppressed these symptoms. So sometimes they are not visible even in the body of first-class devotees for certain circumstantial reasons. Therefore, real steady bhava is definitely displayed in the matter of cessation of material desires, kshanti, utilization of every moment in the transcendental loving service of the Lord, aviharta kalatvam, and this is from Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya 23, verses 18 to 19. Eagerness for glorifying the Lord constantly, namagane sadaruchi, again from Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya 23, but this time verse 32. Attraction for living in the land of the Lord, pritis tad vashati, stale pritis tad vashati stale. Complete detachment from material happiness, virakti, and pridelessness, mana shunyata. One who has developed all these transcendental qualities is really possessed of the bhava stage, as distinguished from the stone-hearted imitator or mundane devotee. The whole process can be summarized as follows. The advanced devotee who chants the holy name of the Lord in perfect, offenseless manner and is friendly to everyone can actually relish the transcendental taste of glorifying the Lord. And the result of such realization is reflected in the cessation of all material desires, etc., as mentioned above. The neophytes, due to their being in the lower stages of devotional service, are invariably envious. So much so that they invent their own ways and means of devotional regulations without following the acharyas. As such, even if they make a show of constant chanting the holy name of the Lord, they cannot relish the transcendental taste of the holy name. Therefore, the show of tears in the eyes, trembling, perspiration, or unconsciousness, etc., is condemned. They can, however, get in touch with the pure devotee of the Lord and rectify their bad habits. Otherwise, they shall continue to be stone-hearted and unfit for any treatment. A complete progressive march on the return path home back to Godhead will depend on the instructions of the revealed scriptures directed by a realized devotee. What a purport. Tad asmasaram hridayam bhatedam yad grihyamanhaya harinama dehyaya yad virkriyetat yadavikaro netre jalam gatra ruheshu harshaha. Certainly that heart is steel framed, which, in spite of one's chanting the holy name of the Lord with concentration, does not change when ecstasy takes place, tears fill the eyes, and hairs stand on end. So there's just tons and tons of stuff in this purport. This is like a summary study of Krishna consciousness in general. And it's interesting to note, I had never scoped or focused in on the fact that this is kind of a overview verse. This verse describes this whole second canto, describing that the first chapter is called the first step in God realization. This chapter is called the change of heart. So we have these various chapter names, and these, as Prabhupada has described in his purport, gradually help us to come to a higher stage. Of course, one thing that's obvious when reading these verses that have led up to this point, these verses from the second canto particularly, these are not steps that we generally follow. It's kind of looking at a broader perspective, and for those who are prior to devotional service. But of course, it gradually brings us into the actual process of devotional service. And here we are starting to discuss the higher platforms of devotional service. We have Ado Shraddha Tata Sadhu Sangota Bhajana Kriyaha Tata Narta Nivritisya Tata Nischa Ruchistata Atta Shaktistata Bhavas Tata Prema Vyudanshati Sadhakanam Ayam Premna Pradurbhave Bhavet Kramaha. So that's from the Nectar of Devotion, I believe it's there. And it describes 9 stages of devotional service. Ado Shraddha, first there is Shraddha or faith. Tatu sadhu sangha, then we get into associating with devotees. Then there's bhajana kriya, and generally we describe bhajana kriya as the acceptance of a spiritual master and beginning to prosecute the path of devotional service under his guidance. That's bhajana kriya. Then narta nivriti. Narta nivriti means that bhajana kriya has become successful and unwanted things from the heart have begun to leave. So we have anarta nivriti. Then there's nishta, which is steadiness. When a person becomes free from unwanted things, they become steady in devotional service. Nishta. Then there is ruchi, which is taste, where someone actually develops a taste for devotional service to the point where one is not at all attracted by material allurements and is steady because their taste has actually already been realized in their own life. And this is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita, where one may be originally restricted from sense objects, but the taste for them remains. However, ceasing such engagements by experience a higher taste, one is fixed in consciousness. So that's alluded to in the, I believe, 2nd chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Then above taste we have the atashaktis, which is attachment. In this case, we think of this attachment as indicating a particular beginning of an attachment for a particular kind of devotional service in the spiritual world, which leads on to bhava, which is the next stage, which is where one is beginning to act in that particular relationship in the spiritual world, which matures in the 9th stage, which is prema. So these 9 stages are the change in heart, that gradually we go from what's called vidhi bhakti, or sometimes vaidhi bhakti, it's written in different ways, but we go from devotional service in regulative principles to the stage where we get, the following of the footsteps of the devotees, footsteps of great devotees. So then we have raga-anuga bhakti, and that is followed by the 3rd classification, which is ragatmika bhakti, where we actually experience the bliss of devotional service, and we are not really under rules and regulations anymore, because we are actually experiencing the ecstasy of devotional service and our contact with Krishna. So at that point, the heart has been substantially purified. And these higher stages are somewhat mysterious, but these higher stages are characterized, the upper 2 stages of Raganuga and Ragatmika Bhakti are basically characterized by one's experience of ecstasy in devotional service. We are not just performing the motions of devotional service, we are experiencing the real result of devotional service, which is transcendental ecstasy, which is what's being described in this verse today. And so Prabhupada quotes a couple of verses from the Madhya Lila of Chaitanya Charitamrita, where Lord Chaitanya is speaking to Sanatana Goswami and describing these culmination of the path of Bhakti Yoga. This, 9-step process that we just discussed from Rupa Goswami as we go from Shraddha to Prema, these 9 stages, are the same as this, Vaidhi Bhakti to Raganuga Bhakti to Ragatmika Bhakti. The highest ones are Ragatmika Bhakti, and below that, with Atashaktis, I believe, we have Raganuga Bhakti, and then those below there are Vaidhi Bhakti, where we're working in the practice of devotional service, but no spontaneous feeling has manifested yet. However, what's, I think, very important here is this whole idea of people imitating these symptoms. So in devotional literature, these higher moods or these higher ecstasies of devotional achievement are listed, as Prabhupada lists them here, the palpitations, perspiration, horripulations on the skin, hair standing on end, devastation, various, symptoms are described. And these are symptoms of those who have reached this stage of, bhava or prema, or the higher classifications of, raganuga or ragatmika bhakti. These are the external symptoms. But in a theatrical way, people can mimic these symptoms, at least some of them. And this has become, in India, an entire cottage industry that people have discovered how to gain fame and fortune by mimicking these various symptoms. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakur has described, that there are, some, 14, 15 deviant sects. He describes the Olas, the Bolas, the Chudadaris, the Sakibekis, the Neda Nadis, the Ativadis, the Garanga Nagaris. There's so many of them. And the reason that Bhaktivinoda Thakur has mentioned these different groups, this is, if you really examine this and you study these different groups, this is like an entire checklist for how devotional service can go off the rails. These actually almost comprise an encyclopedia of what can go wrong in devotional service, how you can spin devotional service just slightly in one direction or another and get something that is on the surface apparently devotional service, but at its core is completely wrong. It's got something rotten going on there. And what might be surprising to some is we had Lord Chaitanya appear roughly, 600 years ago, in the 15th century, 14th, 15th century. And after Lord Chaitanya, there was the 6 Goswamis. And not long after the 6 Goswamis, the entire Vaishnav, project of bringing people back home, back to Godhead, was essentially completely in the mud. It had gone completely off the rails and had been overcome by these various misinterpretations of the Vaishnava tradition. So much so that Bhaktivinoda Thakur, when he made an investigation of Vaishnavism, he wasn't interested in it because it had become so disreputable in India. Partly this happened due to, at least it mentions it in one of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's biographies, that there was a group of printers in India. This is when printing started to become, manifest in the world after Gutenberg, so Gutenberg invented the printing press. And then it was possible to publish, large quantities of books of certain types, Before that, during Lord Chaitanya's time, books had to be hand-scribed by someone who literally tried to copy every letter in the entire thing. So you can imagine how laborious, how prone to various difficulties and problems and mistakes that might have been. However, with the advent of Gutenberg, then the printing press came to be, and eventually this technology, this advanced technology, filtered its way into India, and a certain group of printers named the Bharatalas, they took up the process of printing because they knew that in Bengal especially, Bengal is where all this good stuff comes from, so they knew especially in Bengal that this would be very popular and would sell. So they printed all these various things about Lord Chaitanya, but they made no distinction between actual bona fide literatures and those that were, various strange interpretations that were being given by these various groups, the Bolas, the Olas, the, Guranga Nagaris, et cetera, et cetera. So this led to a mass proliferation of all this spurious literature that created a complete dense fog of disreputable and inaccurate representations of Lord Chaitanya's philosophy. And as this filtered into and through India, in general, Vaishnavism got a bad reputation. So much so that, as I said, Bhaktivinoda Thakur in his original investigation left it aside. He studied, Christianity and Islam, and he studied many of the philosophers of the day. And finally, a friend of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's gave him an authentic version of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. And at that point, Bhaktivinoda Thakur decided that this Vaishnavism is really the final pinnacle of religion. At that point, he changed and said that this is, he needed to bring this back, to give it its pure form. And he went to war with these different groups. And the history of these different groups is interesting because, as I say, it gives us a checklist. And if we try to understand these different groups and what is not right about them, we can check the tendency within our own movement to deviate in one of these directions. And in this nice book by Suhotra, the Apasampradayas, it describes these different groups that are listed by the Thakur in all their resplendent glory. It describes how they came to be, who followed them, why, and what their core values were, And they sift out into kind of three categories, The one category is the basically the Smartas and the Jati Gosani. This category is the category of those who follow some mundane concept of Vedic literature. The Jati Gosanis are the ones who are those who believe that the process of Krishna consciousness can only be promulgated by a certain family, because that family has the genetic DNA of Lord Nityananda. They claim to be direct descendants from Lord Nityananda in some way, shape, fashion, or form. If you actually do the genealogical, investigation, you discover that it's not exactly like that. They are descendants of Nityananda's disciples, not even his particular, because Nityananda had 2 wives, and he didn't have a lot of children, and the one child that we hear of the most was a sannyasi. So there's no direct line. So it's coming from Nityananda's followers' children. But anyway, the idea is that if you were born in the right family, you have the Shakti, or the auspices, to be able to deliver. And if you're not, then there's no way you could be able to initiate people into Vaishnavism. So this is the Jati Goswami misunderstanding. The next category is these, smartas. And for them, again, they also place a lot of emphasis on birth and being in a particular family. But their main theme is that the Vedas give us prescriptions for how to follow certain, yagyas and various Vedic formulas, so that we can enjoy in the material world and maybe be elevated to the heavenly planets. So this is, Pravrti Marg. So basically, the smartas are the preachers of Pravrti Marg, of how to enjoy in the material world or be elevated to the heavenly planets. Now, this third category is the category of our Prakriti Sahajiyas. So the Prakriti Sahajiyas externally appear, as we've been described here in this purport, they externally appear to follow or mimic the activities of Vaishnavas. Sometimes they dress like Vaishnavas. Certainly, Kirtan is central to the olas and the bolas, and there's kind of like a class system. The olas at the bottom, then there's the bolas, and then there's another couple above them. And they work as kind of, a system among themselves. And so they tend to be expert musicians. They tend to be travelers. They certainly give an external appearance of renunciation. They tend not to have many possessions. But they go from one convocation of meetings to another one, where they observe various festivals. However, they all have their, consorts, and the idea of sexual, propriety is not an important issue with them at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. In fact, they have their consorts, and in this way they take to chanting, and they have their various liaisons, and in this way they prosecute their version of Vaishnavism. And you can see this is what really led to the degradation of the public conception of what Vaishnavism was, because you had lots of these kind of people doing this kind of activity. The Suhotra describes that this word, sahajiya, prakrita means material, and sahaja is the word for natural or normal. And he describes that their origin is, of course, Bengal, and it stems from a time when Buddhism was very prominent in India. Strangely enough, it goes back to the Buddhist tradition, And there was Buddhism has the Mahayana and the Hinayana schools, the little vehicle and the great vehicle. But there's another school, which is the Vajrayana, or the diamond path. And this diamond path is more prominent in northern India, where you have various kind of focus on tantricism. And so this diamond path is convoluted with some of these mystical processes of the tantrics, sometimes also called the agora path or the left-handed path. And so this mysticism usually involves a lot of very questionable activities and extreme focus and determination to perform various activities that drive the senses beyond the ordinary through extremes of deprivation, through extremes of pain, through extremes of disgusting activity, through extremes of sexual indulgence. So these are all parts of this kind of thing. And later, this became, when Buddhism was kind of driven from India gradually, this splashed over into the Vedic tradition, which was eventually, came to a large following in Bengal, where there was no such notion as trying to avoid sex life as part of the Vaidhi Bhakti process, but there was actually a sense that through indulgence one could become free from such things. So this was the idea that through indulging in these things one could become free. And in this way, these various bolas and olas would travel all through India, and they would do their bhajan, and they would write mystical poems which were very obscure in their meaning, and they would get together, and of course they would have their consorts which they would swap out when they went to a different convocation, and they would deride any devotees who would describe the fact that, one needed to perform some austerities in devotional service. They would say, well, what's the need of these austerities? Krishna didn't perform any austerities, and this is the natural path. This is how we get this idea of natural path, the sahajiyas. So one should not try to artificially control the senses. They will be controlled by just simply engaging in these various activities that the bolas and olas did. Ostensibly, mostly it was kirtan. They were good singers, and they would have these big kirtans. But also, there was this, from this Buddhistic and tantric, origin, also there was a lot of, hashish and other uses of ganja, so that one could get these ecstasies that are being described in the Vedic literatures. That way one didn't have to work so hard. They were easier to come by. And so this whole thing branched out into a number of different variations. Some of them simply just had their, sex life and engaged in their kirtan, while others actually imitated the activities of the Supreme Lord. Like you had the Chudadaris and there's another group. There was two different groups where one group would imitate Krishna by, having a peacock feather, and the others would imitate the gopis And usually they would be men, so there would be all these men dressed up as gopis, and they would do this dance, and one would be dressed up as Krishna. So you have this imitative kind of false representation. And then at the same time, on the other side, you had those who didn't necessarily imitate. They would just add to their kirtan a few enhancing activities that would help the kirtan be more blissful. So this was the kind of thing, and these became so numerous and so prominent that Vaishnavism was essentially choked out until Bhaktivinoda Thakur and subsequently his son Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati went on an entire campaign, a war against these groups to explain what they were really up to, and that these groups did not represent the genuine expression of Vaishnava tradition. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur had to do a lot. He wrote a lot. He explained a lot about these. Of course, he didn't only fight these. He also fought, Ram Mohan Roy and his, hodgepodge connection of things, and he fought so many other things. But still today, these things are not, we're not talking about ancient history here. There are still bolas and olas and all these groups in Bengal. They still exist. They didn't disappear. And you will still sometimes run across these. We were doing this whole, explanation of these different groups at one point, and one of the devotees saw something on the internet of someone so-and-so Ola, so these groups are not historical. They didn't die out like the dinosaurs. They're still there. And Bengal is full of them. And often we see this thing that's being described here, that such individuals will feign ecstasy, trembling, rolling on the ground, rolling of the eyes, and those who have not actually investigated through the help of being genuine students of a bona fide spiritual master and actually reading the scriptures will take such symptoms as being symptoms of great ecstasy, and such people must be high devotees. So in this way, they earn a living by getting donations and by defrauding the public in this kind of way. And this goes on. And of course in India, you can actually get by doing this kind of thing. It doesn't work so well in the West, although it does have its following in the West as well. So at any rate, I bring this up because, again, this is a checklist of things. How can Krishna consciousness go wrong? How can it go off the rails? One way is through the smarta jati Goswami tendency, which is to think of spiritual life as being the property of one family, one genetic line, or alternatively, to think that spiritual life has to do with pious activities to earn material benefits, either here or on the heavenly planets. Another possibility is the Mayavad tradition of imagining the Supreme Lord ultimately to be formless. And the third is this, Sahajiya tendency, the tendency to engage in outward devotional activities and even a external semblance of devotional dress, while at the same time performing none of the austerities that are key to the practice of Vaidhi Bhakti. Vaidhi Bhakti requires austerities, particularly sexual control, and particularly avoidance of any intoxicants. So, as Prabhupada mentions here, if someone is apparently displaying great ecstasies, but at the same time is engaged in intoxication, at the same time is engaged in clandestine illicit sex, such a person cannot actually be experiencing these true ecstasies, because they are not given to someone who is still at the lowest stage of enjoying material happiness based on these lower modes and acting in these lower modes. Okay, so I want to leave some time for discussion, but I always have a problem with these kind of verses that have too much stuff in them. So, at any rate, any questions or comments? Yes?
Thank you, Maharaj. A couple of points I'd like you to elaborate upon. One is the heart that's being steel framed. Sounds familiar to me.
It's strangely familiar to me, too.
So if you're not experiencing ecstasy, it means our heart is steel framed, and that steel framing is predominantly due to offenses. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yeah, that's what we have to come down to recognizing, that I didn't experience ecstasy this morning when I was chanting japa. No tears came to my eyes, no horripulations, no hair standing on end. And it didn't happen yesterday either. And it hasn't happened this week so far. So therefore, I know that in Padma Purana there are 10 offenses listed. And therefore, I must be committing these offenses, blaspheming the devotees of the Lord, considering the names of the demigods to be equal to, disobeying the spiritual master, blaspheming Vedic literatures, coming up with some rendition of what the Shastras say, which is not actually the real thing, making sinful activities on the strength of chanting, thinking the holy name to be equal to the various pious activities, instructing the faithless, or finally maintaining material attachments even after understanding so many instructions. So these are our 10 offenses. And, in some temples they say these every morning. And I still try to recite them every once in a while and meditate upon them and try to understand which ones I'm committing, because if we make an earnest endeavor, we can overcome them, and then there may be some hope for these, symptoms to occur in our heart to become not steel framed. Do you want to say something more?
Yeah, ecstasy comes in different dimensions. So, just for the sake of exploring the argument a little further, it's not always that it becomes externally so much visible, but like there's this picture of Prabhupada where he's very grave and people were thinking he was very serious, and Prabhupada said there was a moment of deep ecstasy. So the idea of having to have external manifestation is a partial truth.
Right.
There's the other side. So just for the benefit of the doubt, when you're practicing and you're not rolling on the ground, sobbing and crying, there can still be
ecstasy, yes.
There can still be ecstasy.
As Prabhupada says here.
Ecstasy can also just manifest in steadiness and taste and dedication in devotional service, which I don't want to say is good enough, but is a good indicator in and of itself. I mean, I'm just putting it forward. I'm not making a claim.
Well, what Prabhupada is saying here is that oftentimes, as he says, circumstantial reasons, the devotee may not display these symptoms. We see that great devotees, far from showcasing their ecstasies, often try to hide them or get rid of them in some kind of way, So this is also something that we can see, that.
Thank you. And one question, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he wrote some poems and some songs, and he signed them as Bhakta Das Bhau.
Yeah, right.
Because he kind of had that group in mind, and he wanted to pass a message to them, so he used that strategy.
He even wrote in their musical style as this is bridge preaching of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So, this is interesting, that he tried to convert them, and he tried to, write literature that would dissolve their false notions of things, Yes, Ram Roy. So we'll wait for the gate to close. It always is impossible to hear or understand while the gate is closing.
One thought come to my mind. Prabhupada taught us to be constantly engaged in preaching and ministerial work through maxim, work now, samadhi later. In Kalad, glorifies Lord Nishinde with prayers, Prabhupada says in one purport, unless one is interested in speaking to the conditioned souls, to convince them about Krishna consciousness and devotional service, to overcome the modes of material nature is practically impossible. And Prabhupada telling to Tamal Krishna, you should work very, very hard preaching, and then when you're mature, you can retire to Vrindavan. Otherwise, the mind will disturb. Well, Prabhupada, how will we know that when we're mature? That we will have to see. As for myself, I am not so mature. So, we follow Prabhupada in his mood. We are on the safer side, individually, collectively, as a society, is not derailing off the rails. And Prabhupada's last statement in New York, coming down the elevator, 50th Street, being driven to the airport flight to London, and we had actually asked for a discussion amongst the senior men whether to stay or to rest. And Prabhupada had some serious symptoms. He had really bad cold or difficulty breathing. He read in Hari Sari's diary when he arrived in London, and what to speak of suppressing ecstatic symptoms, Prabhupada was hiding and suppressing how much difficulty his physical condition was in. The devotees, with full-blown airport arrival, his Rohini Nanda with a big umbrella over Prabhupada's head, everyone's enjoys, and comes back in manner, gives a lecture, and Hari Sari understood how much distress Prabhupada was physically experiencing. And so Prabhupada, he's come, stay and rest, don't need an honorary rest, and Prabhupada said, okay, let's have a discussion, but, Prabhupada, he's going to do whatever he wants to do. So he put down his cane in the elevator and said, I've taken a benediction from Krishna, just like Arjuna, to go on fighting till the last breath. And he walked out the door, out of the Bhagavatam Mandir. Those were his last words. Heroic words. So these people aren't heroes at all. They're not concerned about saving the fallen conditioned souls at all. In fact, they're concerned about exploiting the fallen conditioned souls, making these false caricatures and exploiting the natural tendency in conditioned souls to want to enjoy matter. Say, here, you can be spiritual and sleep. And not only can you be spiritual, have your cake and eat it too, but we're going to give you like a maha cake here, not just like a little cupcake, and it's authorized, it's very dangerous people. So, I think it's fairly easy myself to not be swayed or be moved by such things, but to protect the, new devotees, neophytes, whoever, whatever, this should just be very much stressed that our mood is compassion. Why did Lord Chaitanya relish the mood of Prahlad?
Mm-hmm.
Part of the Bhagavatam, Gadadhar Pandit, for goodness sakes, in the Gambhira, where like the top, there's a photograph in the original Bhakti Lila Volume 5, there's Gambhira, the place where Lord Chaitanya, maybe it's a picture of the Jagannath temple from the outside, the place where Lord Chaitanya taught and demonstrated the topmost principles of love of God. This is the gateway, compassion to the fallen conditioned souls. It said we glorify the Vaishnava, full of compassion to the fallen conditioned souls. And Prabhupada, we're all here today, every single one of us, because of Prabhupada's compassion. out on the road 14 times and sleep like 2 or 3 hours a day and spend 4 hours dictating and writing the Bhagavatam and initiating thousands of disciples and dealing with so much crisis management and going on the morning walk. Prabhupada's just unbelievably amazing, so we should just follow him and we'll be safe from this terrible nonsense.
We'll do Krishna Kripa, then Narada Rishi.
Very brief statement. I believe in the history of ISKCON there were some devotees in Hawaii who didn't really follow all 4 of the regular principles. They did the illicit sex and the intoxication.
Yeah, these are interesting personal case histories of of ISKCON.
And Srila Prabhupada, when talking about that issue, said that they were asked, well, how long will it take these people to go back to God? And Prabhupada said 300 births.
300. Yeah, we've had many kind of. This shows that this stuff is not. We're not just reading history or some kind of theoretical stuff. This happens, and it happens in our movement too. So we have to be careful. Rishi, your final. What's that?
Svāmī has written a booklet.
Who?
Svāmī. Oh, you have.
That's what it is.
So he has described 13 types of this Savajas.
Right.
And he did a lot of investigation in India.
Right.
And he finally came to the conclusion.
It's a fascinating book, actually. It describes the history, the details, the various misunderstandings, and what their activities are, and so on and so forth.
Right. So my question is, Prabhupada has mentioned very clearly that this Au, Bau, Kartamasai, Gaurang Nagari is all 13 types. When we read that, it appears to be like Gaudiya Vaishnava Siddhanta. It appears to be same.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is how to discriminate that.
Right. Well, Prabhupada here gives us the indication that are they engaged in illicit activities? If they're engaged in intoxication, engaged in illicit sex. I mean, you have this going on in Vrindavan too. It's not like it isn't going on there either, So it's not just a Bengal thing, but this kind of usually that's the way to sift it out. That if there's some illicit connection either with sex life or illicit connection with intoxication, then we can know it's not genuine. Yeah.
I like Ram Roy's point about the lack of compassion as an indicator, because sometimes like Chatu Gosais or especially Smartas, they may be very punctilious in their sadhana, but there's something lacking.
Right.
And that's usually compassion and working for the benefit of others.
Right.
Rather, they're exploiting them.
That's another good indicator.
Mentality. So these are tendencies that are to be safeguarded against, because we see them in ourselves or in our own movement, that they're just like Kaliya's heads, they're continuously trying to uprise, and unless the Sankirtan goes on and Krishna kicks those heads down, they will continuously come and vomit poison that is kind of ruining, it's spoiling the sauce, so to speak. So it's not, that was then, but it's, why did they spend so much time investigating this and documenting this? What's the use, the benefit for us? That would be a thing of the past.
Yeah.
It's clearly understood that these are the main ways to go off in gross or subtle ways.
Yeah, it occurred to me when I was doing some classes on this that this is kind of a sort of checklist, and if we see these symptoms anywhere in ISKCON, that there's something not quite right there. We had the Gopi Bhava Club, we had this thing in the, that was LA, then we had this thing in Hawaii, and it's not like these things won't pop up,
Things are ongoing.
Yeah. Yes, Rishi.
But at the same time, Maharaj, when we go to this Babaji's Radha, etc., when they talk to us, it appears to be they are very advanced in the sense they know so many slokas and the philosophy they talk.
Some do, yeah.
Such a way they talk.
Yeah.
It appears to be eternal, very impressive. And the conditioned souls, means innocent souls, they become victims.
Right, right. So innocent souls become victimized by the, fake trembling, the fake rolling on the ground. In-conditioned souls become captivated by musically interesting kirtans, but done by people who have absolutely no real devotion. Ramla?
This is a historical case of Radharaman Das Babaji, who was elder in the farm. He was the one who started Tagore, Radhesham, Chapahari, Ram. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was a relatively younger person in his 30s. And he stood, and everything exhibited by this Babaji was just, looked really, really good. But there's just one thing, and only Srila Bhaktisiddhanta picked it up, and it's a gigantic thing. He said, do not chant Maha Mantra loudly. You chant it within your mind, and I will give you a new mantra. And so Srila Bhaktisiddhanta stood up, who are you? This is the mantra that and all of the so-called contemporary elite, they all attack Srila Bhaktisiddhanta.
Yeah.
Who are you? You're just a young upstart, this, that, the other thing. So, but this person deviated to Sampradaya. You see what Srila Prabhupada is writing about Haridas Thakur's Samadhi in Bhakti Leela. He's giving the history of the Samadhi Mandir. Said now it's been captured and it's under the authority of someone else. You go to Jagannath Puri, someone else goes with Nitai Gaur, Radhesham, Hare Krishna. And behind the Krishna Bhavan Mandir, if you've ever stayed in a guest house on that side, there's a constant war with their loudspeakers, the Nitai Gaur, Radhesham. They're right on the corner there.
Where is that?
If you make a right out of the guest house and you're going to be
In Vrindavan?
now they broke you can walk to the Russian house, which with the recent I heard that a proper bribe was given and they're not going to bulldoze it. Not a place to buy a house, not an apartment, contested building. Anyway. So right on the corner there, if you walk out the guest house gates and make a right, and you're going to make another right, like you're going to walk the MBT, it's that property right on that corner. So, Kali Yuga is, you really need a very powerful and authorized devotee to show even just the third class and even maybe the second class devotees what really is the thing, because so many people believed in this Radharaman Das Babaji and still today. And for all extents and purposes, many of them are actually following principles and they're not engaging in illicit sex, but they believe this to be the gospel truth. There's some underlying Mayavad tendency there that eludes the general devotee's observation. That's another point that we have to very much deepen our own devotion so that you cannot see me with ordinary eyes, therefore I give you divine eyes. Chaputan Divo J. Like that. We have to to be given the proper vision, we actually have to be very confidential devotees. And to be considered a confidential devotee has to test, that you're never again going to create a disturbing situation. So Radha and Krishna let you into their realm. That purport in the Gundicha chapter 12, Madhya Leela, that Prabhupada gives this is Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, and lists all the different things that can happen, a checklist. And Prabhupada says there, the neophyte is certain to be attacked by these things, one after the other. So it's part of the testing situation. These people just weren't sincere to pass all the tests, and they just got hung up on this stuff.
All right, so this has been a nice session, a lot of nice realizations and discussion. So all glories to Śhrīmad-Bhāgavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord, all glories to Radha Govinda Dev, Hare Krishna.